She was my boss, confident, untouchable, and far beyond my reach. But that night, when she locked the office and whispered, "You're not done until I say," the line between power and desire began to blur. The office felt different at night. When everyone else had gone home, the building turned into something almost otherworldly. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder, the shadows stretched longer across the walls, and every sound carried through the empty floor. I sat at my desk, papers spread in uneven stacks, the cursor blinking on my screen as though mocking me for not keeping up. My back ached, my tie felt too tight, and my eyes burned from hours of reading. And then there was her. My boss. She stood by the tall windows that overlooked the city, arms folded, her silhouette lit by the glow of street lamps and neon signs below. At 42, she had the kind of presence that didn't need to be announced, graceful, composed, quietly commanding. She was everything I wasn't yet, certain of herself, unshakable, a woman who moved through the world with authority that seemed untouchable. But there was something about her in that moment that drew me in, not just her elegance, but the way the faint reflection of city lights played against her features, softening what everyone else in the office would call stern. I was still scribbling notes when her voice cut through the silence. Low. Firm. Measured. "You're not done until I say." The words weren't harsh, not even scolding. They were deliberate. And the way she said them made the air shift between us. Before I could reply, I heard it, the click of the office door behind me. Locked. The sound was sharper than it should have been, echoing louder in the empty room, settling into me with a strange weight. It wasn't threatening. It was final, sealing us off from the world outside. I glanced up at her. She didn't move right away, just kept her eyes on the city, as if it were easier to watch the endless lights than to look directly at me. My chest tightened. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe it was the way the quiet made everything feel magnified, but I couldn't shake the awareness that we were alone. Alone in a space that wasn't just professional anymore. I forced myself to focus on the papers, the numbers, the endless details that needed reviewing, but it was impossible not to feel her presence. Every shift of her heels against the polished floor, every rustle of fabric as she adjusted her blazer, it all filled the silence between us. I told myself she was just being the boss, that she didn't mean anything beyond work. But the truth was, the way the office felt, dim, closed off, intimate, made it impossible not to wonder if something else lingered in her words. "You're not done until I say." I repeated the phrase in my head as I pressed my pen harder against the paper. My hands were steady, but my mind wasn't. Because for the first time, staying late at the office didn't feel like an obligation. It felt like the beginning of something I couldn't quite name. For a long moment, she didn't say anything after locking the door. She just leaned back against the edge of her desk, her eyes traveling over the papers as if measuring the weight of both the work and the silence between us. Then, almost casually, she slid her blazer from her shoulders. It was such a small gesture, but it changed everything. I had only ever seen her in full command, sharp suits, clipped heels, a voice that left no room for hesitation. But now, with her blazer folded neatly across the desk, she seemed less like the untouchable figure who ruled the office and more like a woman. A woman who had been carrying long days, heavy expectations, and perhaps a loneliness no one else ever thought to notice. "You're too focused," she said, her voice softer now, more thoughtful. "Do you even remember what time it is?" I smiled faintly without looking up from the page. "Past late, I'm sure." Her laugh, short, unguarded, almost tired, filled the space between us. That's one way to put it. When I finally glanced up, I caught her watching me, and not in the critical way she usually did during the day. Her eyes lingered, curious, as if trying to read something beneath the surface. I froze under her gaze, but it wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt like she was silently inviting me to step beyond the safe walls of small talk and deadlines. "What about you?" she asked suddenly. "What do you really want to do, when you're not drowning in reports?" The question caught me off guard. No boss had ever asked me that. And the way she tilted her head, waiting patiently, told me she wasn't asking out of politeness. She wanted to know. I hesitated, then shrugged, speaking slower than I intended. I guess. I want to build something of my own someday. Not just chase deadlines. Something that matters. Something that feels like mine. Her eyes softened, though her expression remained carefully composed. She nodded, almost to herself, as if my answer had reached some hidden part of her. That's good, she murmured. That's more than I expected you to say. I wanted to ask what she meant, but before I could, she sighed quietly and leaned back further against the desk. For the first time, she looked tired. Not the kind of tired you shake off with coffee, but the kind that comes from carrying too much for too long. Her posture loosened, her hand brushing against her temple as though the day's weight was finally settling in. And in that moment, I saw her differently. Not just as my superior, not just as the brilliant woman in charge, but as someone human. Someone who felt the same long nights I did, someone who perhaps longed for connection as much as I did. The faint scent of her perfume reached me again, subtle but undeniable, mingling with the familiar paper and ink smell of the office. It was disarming, grounding, and yet intoxicating all at once. I tried to steady my focus, but it was no use. Every sigh, every shift of her presence made it harder to remember that I was supposed to be just an employee, and she was supposed to be just my boss. Because in that moment, she wasn't untouchable anymore. She was real. And she was right there, closer than I'd ever imagined. I tried to anchor myself in the work in front of me, numbers, lines, corrections. The familiar rhythm of pen against paper should have been enough to steady me. But it wasn't. Not with her moving closer. Her heels clicked softly on the polished floor, steady and measured, until she was standing behind me. I felt it before I saw it, the faint warmth of her presence, the subtle change in the air that told me she was near. My chest tightened. "Show me what you've done," she said gently, not with the clipped tone she used in morning meetings, but with something quieter, something more curious. I nodded, shifting the document toward her. She leaned down over my shoulder, close enough that a strand of her hair brushed against the side of my cheek. I froze. My pen hovered uselessly above the page. Her hand reached out, her fingertip tracing a line on the paper as she spoke. "This part, you're too cautious with the language. It sounds hesitant." Her skin barely grazed my arm as she steadied the sheet, but the contact sent a current racing through me. I told myself it was nothing. Accidental. Professional. But the way her hand lingered a second too long made me doubt my own reasoning. I swallowed, forcing myself to focus. I didn't want to be too direct. Her lips curved into the faintest smile as she tilted her head toward me. Sometimes directness is what makes people listen. The words were about work, but the way she said them carried something else. A challenge, maybe. Or an invitation. I nodded slowly, my mind working less on the document and more on the meaning behind her tone. She was still close, so close that I could feel her breath, warm and steady, brushing against my neck. The office heater hummed quietly, but all I noticed was her nearness. The silence between us grew thick, heavy with unspoken thoughts. I dared a glance sideways, and for an instant, our eyes met. She didn't look away immediately. The power balance I'd always felt so strongly, boss and subordinate, authority and obedience, didn't feel the same anymore. It was shifting, blurring. She wasn't simply giving instructions. She was letting me see something beyond the walls of professionalism. Her voice broke the silence, playful in a way I'd never heard from her before. "You're too careful with words," she teased lightly, her lips barely an inch from my ear. "Not everything needs to be polished." I laughed softly, though it came out a little uneven, my throat tight. "Maybe I just like being careful." Her smile lingered, eyes narrowing just slightly, amused. "Or maybe you're afraid of what happens if you're not." I couldn't answer. The words hung between us, daring me, daring her, filling the quiet office with something unspoken but undeniable. For the first time, it didn't feel like she was my boss correcting me. It felt like something else entirely, something personal, something dangerous, something alive. And I wasn't sure I wanted to resist it. The quiet stretched between us, long enough for me to wonder if I had crossed an invisible line just by holding her gaze too long. She didn't move right away. Instead, she walked slowly back to her desk, her fingertips brushing along its surface as though she were searching for something invisible to steady herself. Then she sat, not behind the barrier of her high-backed chair like she usually did, but on the edge of the desk itself, closer to me, closer than she'd ever been during daylight hours. "You know," she began, her voice carrying a softness I wasn't used to hearing, "people think I enjoy being this untouchable figure." I glanced up from the document in front of me, unsure whether she expected an answer. Her eyes were fixed on the floor for a moment before lifting to meet mine. They were sharper than usual, yes, but beneath that sharpness was something else. Something fragile. She gave a quiet laugh, though it sounded more bitter than amused. "They don't realize how exhausting it is, being the one everyone expects to have all the answers. Strong. Composed. Always in control." Her words struck something in me. I had always admired her authority, her composure, the way she never seemed rattled. I hadn't once considered how heavy it might be to carry. "You don't have to be strong all the time," I said before I could stop myself. My voice sounded smaller than I intended, almost tentative, but the truth was I meant it. Her gaze lingered on me, searching, as if she was trying to decide whether I was naive or whether I really understood. She tilted her head slightly, the faintest smile touching her lips. "That's easy to say when you're not the one everyone's watching." There was a pause. She shifted, one hand resting on the desk beside mine. Not quite touching, but so close that the warmth of her skin seemed to bridge the gap. My fingers twitched involuntarily, and I forced them still. She sighed, her shoulders relaxing as though letting down a guard she rarely lowered. "I've made mistakes," she admitted, her voice low. "With people. Relationships. I've chosen work over everything else. And sometimes I wonder if it was worth it." The vulnerability in her tone startled me. I had never imagined she would say something so personal, not to me, not to anyone in this office. Yet here she was, confessing the kind of truth that doesn't belong in fluorescent-lit rooms filled with files and deadlines. I didn't know what to say. Words felt inadequate. So I just looked at her, really looked at her, not as my boss, not as someone untouchable, but as a woman sitting inches away from me, letting her walls down. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for once she didn't look away. The silence grew heavy-charged. It wasn't professional. It wasn't casual. It was something else. Something neither of us dared to name. Her hand shifted slightly closer on the desk, brushing against mine by the barest margin. Neither of us pulled away. And in that small, accidental touch, I realized something. This wasn't just about late-night work anymore. Something unspoken had passed between us, something neither of us could pretend wasn't there. Her hand stayed near mine, close enough that every second felt like a decision. I could move away. I could pretend not to notice. But I didn't. And neither did she. The silence stretched, thick with everything unsaid. The ticking clock on the wall grew louder, steadier, like it was marking the rhythm of something we weren't ready to admit. I tried to breathe normally, but my chest was tight, each inhale catching as though the air itself was heavier. I slid a file across the desk toward her, trying to anchor myself in the pretense of work. But as she reached for it, our fingers brushed. It should have been nothing. A passing touch. But neither of us pulled back immediately. Her skin was warm against mine, soft yet certain, and for one suspended heartbeat, it was as though the entire world narrowed down to that single point of contact. Her eyes lifted to mine. There was no command there, no authority. Just quiet intensity, searching, almost questioning. My throat went dry. "You ever wonder," she began, her voice low, steady, yet trembling faintly at the edges, "if lines are meant to be crossed?" The question hung between us, dangerous and irresistible. I couldn't answer right away, not because I didn't know, but because I knew too well. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, and I was terrified she might hear it. When I finally found my voice, it was softer than a whisper. "All the time." Her lips parted slightly, as if to speak again, but no words came. Instead, she let out a breath she must have been holding, her shoulders sinking just the smallest degree. That tiny release of tension, that single exhale, told me everything. She felt it too. The room no longer felt like an office. It felt like a space that belonged only to us, suspended in time. The papers, the deadlines, the endless lists, they all blurred into nothing. What remained was her, inches away, and the unspoken pull drawing us closer. Her fingers lingered against mine, then slowly, deliberately, curled back as she took the file. But the absence of her touch only made the memory of it burn stronger. I wanted to reach out to bridge the gap, to brush her hair back from her face, to hold on to that warmth before it vanished. But I didn't. My restraint was both my shield and my prison. She leaned back slightly, her composure returning in fragments, though her eyes betrayed her. "You're careful," she murmured, almost to herself. "Careful in ways that make me wonder what you're holding back." I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because if I said the truth, the thin thread keeping us from crossing that invisible line might snap. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was alive, pulsing, electric. Every glance, every breath, every shift of her body closer or further away carried meaning. And though nothing had happened, though no words of desire had been spoken, I knew we were already standing on the edge of something neither of us could ignore. We hadn't crossed the line yet. But we were standing so close, I wasn't sure how much longer we could resist. The air between us felt charged, like the quiet before a storm. My hands rested on the desk, steady on the surface, though every nerve inside me was restless, waiting for something to happen. She hadn't moved further away, but she hadn't closed the gap either. It was as if we were both suspended in a fragile balance, teetering on the edge of a choice neither of us dared to name. She set the file down, slowly, deliberately, her fingertips brushing the desk as though drawing invisible lines to mark the boundary we both felt pressing in. Then she shifted, stepping closer, so close I could feel the faint warmth of her body, the whisper of her perfume rising with her movement. My breath caught. She leaned forward, her face only inches from mine now. Close enough that I could see the faint lines of exhaustion at the corners of her eyes, close enough that I could trace the softness of her lips if I dared. But she didn't move further. She stopped just there, suspended in the moment, her eyes fixed on mine. It wasn't hesitation. It was restraint. Her voice, when it finally came, was barely more than a whisper. "You're different." I blinked, unsure of what she meant. Different how? She gave the faintest smile, though it carried a weight of truth beneath it. "You don't push. You don't take advantage of silence the way others might. You wait. You notice." The admission hit me harder than I expected. She wasn't just acknowledging the tension between us, she was acknowledging me. Seeing me not just as the younger man behind the reports, but as someone who had been quietly, patiently watching her, not as a boss, but as a person. I swallowed, my voice low, careful. "Maybe I don't want to cross a line you'll regret." Her eyes softened, though they never left mine. For a second, the professional mask she wore during the day slipped entirely. Vulnerability flickered there, raw and unguarded, and it pulled at something deep inside me. She leaned even closer, her hair falling slightly over her cheek, her breath brushing my skin. My hands itched with the impulse to reach up, to tuck the strand gently behind her ear, to let my fingers linger against her face. But I didn't. My restraint held, even as every part of me screamed for more. For a moment, it felt like the world had narrowed to this fragile distance. If either of us moved even an inch closer, there would be no going back. And then she smiled faintly, almost sad. "You're not like the others," she whispered. The words carried warmth, but also finality. She straightened slowly, pulling back, her composure returning piece by piece. The distance between us widened, but the electricity didn't fade. If anything, it left the air even heavier with everything unspoken. I sat there, heart pounding, torn between relief and ache. Because I knew the choice had been made, not to cross the line. Not tonight. But the truth was undeniable. We had both felt it. And no amount of restraint could erase the knowledge of what almost happened. The silence between us lingered after she pulled back, like the echo of something that almost happened, but never quite did. My hands were still on the desk, useless now, my pen forgotten. My heart hadn't settled. I wondered if hers had. For a while, neither of us spoke. She paced slowly toward the office door, her heels soft against the floor, her posture regaining its usual confidence. But I could see the subtle difference now, the faint slump of her shoulders, the way she paused before reaching for the handle. She wasn't as composed as she wanted to appear. Not after what had just passed between us. She stood there, her hand on the lock, but she didn't turn it right away. Instead, she looked back at me. Her eyes were steady, but not cold. They held something else, something warmer, something hesitant. "I shouldn't have kept you this late," she said softly. Her voice lacked the sharp authority it usually carried. It was almost apologetic. I shook my head, forcing a small smile. "I don't mind." Her lips curved, not quite into a smile, more into a weary acknowledgement. She looked at me like she wanted to say more, but the words never came. Instead, she slowly turned the lock. The click echoed through the empty office, but this time, it didn't feel heavy. It felt like release. As she opened the door, the cool night air drifted in, carrying with it the faint hum of the city below. I stood, gathering my papers, though my mind wasn't on work anymore. It was on her. On us. She waited for me by the door, not walking ahead the way she usually did. When I reached her, she surprised me. She lifted a hand and let it rest lightly against my cheek, just for a moment, gentle, fleeting. Her touch was warm, tender, and filled with an affection I had never expected to receive from her. "Thank you," she murmured, though I wasn't sure what she was thanking me for. For staying late? For listening? For not crossing the line? Or maybe, for simply seeing her as something more than the flawless, untouchable figure everyone else imagined her to be. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I only met her eyes, letting the silence say what words couldn't. She lowered her hand, the moment already slipping into memory. We stepped out together into the corridor, the office lights behind us flickering into darkness as if sealing the night away. We didn't walk far, just side by side, down the quiet hall, our footsteps soft and in rhythm. It didn't feel like boss and employee. It felt like two people carrying the weight of something unspoken, something delicate, something that might never be named, but would never be forgotten. Outside, the city was alive with lights and movement, indifferent to the moment we had just shared. She turned to me one last time, her expression unreadable, then gave the faintest nod. Together, yet uncertain. That was where we left it. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. 25.